"You'll die here," they told her, but a gunslinger said, "Not while I breathe." Dust burned her throat as she stumbled, her knees buckling into the dirt of the main street. The voices of men, harsh and jeering, circled her like vultures. Around carrion, "You'll die here," one spat, the words sharp as spurs. His boot kicked the tin cup from her hand, sending it clattering down the road, where tumbleweed rolled free in the wind. Lena raised her face. Sunlight stabbed down mercilessly, showing her hollow cheeks, the cracked line of her lips. She had begged for water, just one swallow, but the town was done with her. To them she was nothing but a burden, the widow of a man who'd gambled himself into an early grave, leaving her debts she could never pay. "You don't belong here," another voice barked. "Best you crawl out into the prairie and let the coyotes have their turn." Her body trembled, not only from hunger but from the sting of shame. She wanted to cry, but her eyes were dry as riverbeds in drought. She pressed her hand against the dirt road, trying to rise, but her legs betrayed her. A laughter rolled over her, ugly, hollow, merciless. Then, from the far end of the street, boots struck the ground with a rhythm that silenced the laughter. The gunslinger came like heat before a storm. His duster flapped in the wind, worn and dust-stained, and the shadow of his hat cut sharp across his eyes. He moved with that deliberate slowness only men who had lived too close to death could carry, every step measured, every gesture carved. "And steal." "That's far enough," the tallest of the men warned. "Ain't your business, stranger." The gunslinger stopped, his hand resting easy on the butt of his Colt. But he didn't draw. He just looked at them, eyes like two flints sparking in the sun. "She dies here," one of the men said. "Not while I breathe." His voice was low, steady, final. The silence that followed pressed heavy. Lena, still on her knees, dared to lift her gaze, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the fragile thread of hope. His words weren't a boast. They weren't bravado. They were a promise. The men shifted. Their leader spat into the dust, masking fear with disdain. "She's nothing. Ain't worth the fight." The gunslinger's jaw tightened and his hand lowered a fraction more. "Then walk away." One by one, the men turned, muttering, retreating down the alleyways like dogs denied a bone. But their eyes lingered, filled with promises of revenge. When they were gone, Lena swayed forward, nearly collapsing. The gunslinger reached her, his hand firm but careful as he lifted her arm over his shoulder. She caught a whiff of leather, sweat, and gunpowder, the scent of a man who lived outside the safety of walls. "Can you walk?" he asked. Her voice was hoarse. "I don't know." "Then lean on me." And she did, because she had no choice, but also because something in his tone, his presence, told her he would not let her fall. The street was silent now. The town, watching from behind cracked shutters and half-closed doors. No one came out to help. No one ever did. Lena tried to speak again as they moved toward the edge of town. Why would you stop for me?" His eyes stayed forward. "Because you're still breathing." The words sank into her, heavy and bewildering, like a seed falling into parched soil. As the sun lowered, painting the land in red and gold, the gunslinger carried her weight step by step out of the place that had abandoned her. Behind them, the jeers might return with nightfall. Ahead of them lay only the wide, dangerous silence of the frontier. But for the first time in so long, Lena felt that silence might carry more mercy than the voices she left behind. And somewhere deep inside, beneath hunger and shame, a spark stirred, not while he breathed. She clung to those words like a lifeline, not yet knowing that they would change not only her fate, but the shape of her very soul. The prairie wind was sharp that night, rattling dry grass like bones whispering secrets. By the time the gunslinger guided Lena into the foothills, her legs had lost all strength. She sagged against him, every step dragging at his broad frame, but he never slowed. His breathing was steady, like the ticking of a clock that refused to stop. They reached a cabin at the edge of a cedar grove, a place built not for comfort but survival. Its boards were weathered silver, its porch crooked, and smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The gunslinger pushed the door open with his boot and led her inside. The air was cold but safe. He set her down gently on a cot covered in wool blankets. She gasped at the sudden relief of lying down, her body sinking into the rough fabric as though it were a feather mattress. He crouched by the hearth, striking flint until sparks caught dry kindling. Soon, a flame licked upward, casting golden light over the room. Shadows danced across his face, making the sharp line of his jaw even sterner, but his eyes softened when they flicked to her. "You'll need water first," he said. From a jug on the shelf, he poured into a tin cup and held it out. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly spilled, but he steadied the cup with his own. The water was cold, tasting faintly of iron, but it was life itself. Tears burned behind her eyes as she drank. He watched her carefully. "When last did you eat?" "3 days," she whispered. Her voice cracked as if ashamed of admitting it. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out jerky and hardtack. It isn't much. To her, it was everything. She chewed slowly, fighting the urge to devour it in one swallow. The taste of salt, the rough texture. It was a banquet in her starved mouth. When she finished, she lay back, staring at the timbered ceiling. "I should thank you." "You don't need to," he said gruffly. "Rest. That's what you need." But her mind was restless. Why did they turn on me? I had nothing to give, nothing left to take. His eyes met hers across the flickering firelight. "Sometimes that's enough. Folks out here don't like weakness. They'd rather bury it than watch it remind them what they fear." Her chest ached, because he was right. She had felt their disgust, their contempt, as if her hunger was contagious. She closed her eyes. The gunslinger rose, moving about the cabin with a practiced rhythm. He poured more water into a basin, washed the dust from his hands, and checked the latch on the door twice. Every sound, every motion was deliberate, as though danger could come knocking at any time. When she opened her eyes again, he was seated in a chair near the fire, hat pulled low, pistol resting across his thigh. His presence filled the room, quiet but unyielding, like a mountain in the dark. "Do you always live alone?" she asked, a pause. "Safer that way." "For you?" "For everyone." Silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. She wanted to press him, to ask why a man carried that kind of loneliness like a badge. But sleep claimed her first. Morning came with pale light and the smell of wood smoke. Lena stirred, stiff but stronger than she had been the day before. The gunslinger had already been out. She could tell by the dew-darkened boots at the door and the faint clink of a pail set down on the porch. When he returned, carrying fresh water, she managed to sit upright. "I can help," she said quickly, afraid of seeming useless. "You'll help when you're strong enough," he replied, setting the pail by the hearth. No shame in healing, but shame still clung to her like a second skin. She thought of her husband's debts, the sneers of the townsfolk, the way she had been cast out like spoiled meat. Every memory whispered that she was nothing, that survival was borrowed, not earned. Later, as he fixed a pot of beans, she asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated before answering. "Caleb." The name felt solid, unshakable, the kind of name that could carry burdens. She nodded. "I'm Lena." Caleb's eyes met hers across the firelight again. "I know." She blinked. "You know me?" He shifted, gaze dropping to the flames. "Heard your story in town. Didn't sit right." Heat rushed to her face, shame, and gratitude twisting together. "And that's why you risked yourself?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't stomach injustice. Doesn't mean I can fix it." But he had fixed something. She was alive, breathing, eating, and for the first time in months, she wasn't cold all the way through. That night, when the fire burned low, Lena whispered a promise into the shadows. "I won't be weak forever." And though Caleb's eyes stayed shut beneath the brim of his hat, she knew he heard her. By the third morning, color had come back to Lena's cheeks. She moved slow but steady around the cabin, the way a foal first learns to trust its legs, testing weight, finding balance. Sun slipped through the chinks between boards, laying pale, ladders across the floor. She climbed them with her chores. She scrubbed the tin cup until it flashed like a small sun. She swept cedar needles from the threshold, letting the sky's smell rush in. She found a needle and a twist of thread in, a cracked tobacco tin, then set about mending the torn lining of Caleb's duster. The jacket was all grit and years, the leather creased like a map of hard places, but her small, neat stitches traveled its edge with a quiet stubbornness that felt like breathing a second time. On the shelf above the hearth lay a ledger, the one she'd carried even when she'd been starving, the one that tallied the debts her late husband had left behind like a trail of stones to drown under. She opened it now and, for the first time, turned the book upside down. On the blank half, she drew a rough rectangle for a garden behind the cabin, beans along the fence, potatoes near the shade, a patch of carrots if the soil would bless them. The scratch of pencil was both prayer and rebellion. Caleb came in with the smell of morning clinging to him. He set a brace of scrawny jackrabbits on the table and watched her from beneath the brim of his hat. "You stitch straight," he said. "Not always," she replied, biting off a thread. "But I finish." Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe, or the recognition of a kind of courage that doesn't flaunt itself. He poured coffee, black as midnight, and handed her a tin mug. "We'll need flour," he said. "Salt, powder. They'll be watching the town." "They?" She didn't have to ask who. The three from the street. More besides. Men like that don't let a humiliation sit. He glanced past her to the ledger. "You mean to plant? If we're to eat more than rabbit and beans." She hesitated. "If we're to stay." He didn't move for a long breath. Then, "Your say." He always did that, hand the choice back to her as if it belonged there. It unsettled and steadied her at once. She could hide in the trees and let him risk himself for her. Or she could walk down Main Street with her head high and the ledger of her life turned to a new page. "I'm going with you," she said. They saddled his roan and a little mule that had come with the cabin, a patient creature with tobacco-brown ears. The trail down from the cedars wound through tawny grass where morning wind hissed like a drawn blade. Caleb rode loose-hipped and quiet, but his eyes saw everything. The smudged toe of a boot print by the creek, the way magpies rose in a sudden start from a cottonwood, the far-off glint of glass where a spy might lie up with a rifle. He said nothing of these things, only shifted the route as if the earth itself had changed its mind. Town sat in a low basin like a tired animal at rest, a strip of buildings with their faces sunburnt, a water tower like a sentinel with a crooked hat, hitching rails lined with horses whose tails flicked at flies with the same rhythm as the gusts lifting dust off the street. Storefront windows watched them ride in. People watched too, women with aprons dusted in flour, men with thumbs, hooked in belts, a boy in a runaway shirt clinging to the post outside the barber's while his father argued inside. Lena swung down from the mule. Dust touched her hem and stayed. The general store bell gave a half-hearted jangle as she pushed through. The world in there was a symphony of simple need. Sacks of flour, blue tins of lard, coils of rope, the sweet, metallic whiff of nails. Mr. Greeley stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled and his eyes traveling over her like he was counting sins. He said nothing, but his mouth set thin. Caleb went to the back for powder and shot. Lena gathered coffee, salt, a little sack of cornmeal, and, after a hesitation, a child's slate and chalk. She didn't know why the slate called to her. Perhaps because the ledger's turned page had made space in her mind for beginnings. Put it on the counter, Greeley said. Not unkind and not kind either. She did, and felt someone step close. Well, if it ain't the debt man's widow, came a lazy voice that rasped like rope. Rand Ketchum leaned there with a smirk stitched into his face, a man who wore his cruelty like a Sunday coat. Albie Cross flanked him, a weasel with a deputy's. Star, someone had forgotten to pin on straight. Lena's mouth went dry, but she angled her shoulders square. Morning. You got nerve enough to come back, Rand drawled. Town don't fancy folks who bring ruin. Caleb's shape filled the corner of her sight, still silent, a storm biding its time. I bring a list, Lena said, tapping the chalk slate. Flour, salt, work to pay if anyone's got honest need, Rand snorted. Honest? Your man gambled and you shared his purse. He shared my hunger, Lena said, voice even. I paid more than he did. Albie laughed. High and mean. Look at her grow teeth. A little boy tugged at her skirt then, sniffling. He was the barber's boy, the runaway post kid, with hair that wouldn't lie flat and eyes too big for his face. Ma'am, he whispered, Mr. Greeley said there ain't no sugar for us till payday. My ma got the cough. The store went, quiet in her pulse. She picked up the smallest paper twist of sugar from the counter and slipped it into the boy's hand, closing his fingers around it. For tea, she said. Tell your mama to drink it hot. Rand's hand shot out, clamping her wrist. That ain't yours to... He didn't finish, because Caleb moved with the swiftness of a hawk stooping. He took Rand's thumb and rolled it back just enough that pain sent the man to his knees without a shot fired. Albie reached for his pistol, but found Caleb's Colt already angled low, not raised, just present like a truth you couldn't argue with. We're done, Caleb said, quiet. Mr. Greeley took a breath he'd been holding since last year. He bagged the flour, the salt, the cornmeal. He threw in a spool of thread and a needle without looking up. On the house, he muttered, which wasn't quite charity and not quite apology. Outside, the sun felt harder. Lena mounted while her hands shook like leaves in a hard wind. Caleb touched the mule's lead. You stood, he said. It wasn't praise. It was fact. She looked at the tiny sugar twist in the boy's fist as he watched them leave. Dependence. The preacher's wife had once told her, in a life that felt foreign, are the reason courage is contagious. The thought settled in her bones with the weight of something trustworthy. They took the creek trail home and found the shadow of more horses than they had ridden out with. Boot prints sidled like snakes where they shouldn't have. Caleb said nothing, but he cut brush to drag behind the mule and smudge their passage. By the time they reached the cedar grove, evening had laid copper along the edges of clouds, and the wind had gone quiet as if the land itself were listening. They set. The sacks down. Caleb checked the rifle. Lena put the flour away, stacked the salt high, and, because fear was crawling up her spine, lit the lantern early and set it on the porch rail. Too bright, Caleb said. It's not for them, she answered. It's for me. Night came with coyotes singing somewhere far and lonely. With it came men, 3 shapes that pulled themselves from the tree line and wore the dark-like second skins. Rand was among them, hand wrapped in a torn bandana from where Caleb had bent his pride. Behind him loomed a 4th figure, a broad man whose coat hung heavy with authority. Sheriff Silas Rourke, eyes pale as river ice. Evening, the sheriff called. Heard you got a vagrant and a thief holed up. I came to correct the ledger. Lena stood on the porch with the coach gun in her hands. It felt immense and honest. Caleb took one step to her right, neither in front of her nor behind. His presence was a cord around her waist, keeping her from being blown off into the dark. "Your ledger's wrong," she said, and her voice surprised her with how much mountain it held. "This is private land. I'll talk in daylight with witnesses and a preacher. I won't be dragged into any more alleys." Rand laughed. "You think that scattergun makes you a man?" "No," she said. "It makes me a woman who's done being scared." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Holster down, mister." Caleb did not lift his Colt. He didn't need to. He spoke instead, calm as dry thunder. "You have no paper, Sheriff. No writ. You step onto this porch and you claim war on a citizen's home." He nodded toward the lantern's small, steady sun. "Best you like seeing because you won't in hell." Silence fell hard. An owl ghosted over the clearing. Lena aimed at the rope looped around the gate post, a crude trip line she'd set with Caleb's help an hour earlier, and squeezed. The recoil slammed her shoulder, the shot cracked clean, the rope snapped, and a deadfall of sticks and scrap timber tumbled between yard and trees, a jagged wall. Rand swore. Albie tripped backward. The sheriff's jaw flexed. "We'll be back," he said, voice flat, "with light enough to see what's what." Lena's arms trembled as the men melted into the dark. When the last branch stopped clattering, she realized her cheeks were wet and she was smiling, wide and bewildered. Caleb's hand hovered. It didn't assume, it asked. When she didn't flinch, he rested it briefly over hers on the gun. "You set your line," he murmured, and, "I'll hold it," she whispered. Behind them, the cabin breathed warm and slow. On the table, the ledger lay open to a page that showed rows of beans and the slope of a fence. In her mind, she saw more. A narrow bed of green, a child's slate marked with letters, a sugar twist steeping in tea, a sheriff reconsidering the cost of paper he did not have. Fear still lived in her, but now it shared the house with something else, something rooted and alive. The prairie listened. Somewhere in that listening, Lena heard her own here. Dawn came thin and gray, the kind of light that makes the prairie feel endless and uncertain. Lena had not slept. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, listening to Caleb oil his Colt at the hearth. Every soft click of metal on metal reminded her of what was coming. The sheriff had promised to return, and men like Rourke kept promises when they involved blood. Caleb holstered the Colt, then checked the rifle propped by the door. "They'll come at first light," he said simply, as if remarking on the weather. Lena's stomach turned. "And if we don't run?" "We can't run," Caleb answered. "They'd ride us down by noon. We stand." The words settled heavy. Stand. She had stood once already, in town, and the taste of it still lingered, part iron, part fire. But to stand against guns and men sworn to see her dead, that was something different. Caleb's gaze shifted toward her, steady and calm. "You'll have choices today, but don't mistake standing for being alone. I'll be beside you." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask why. Why risk his life for hers, a widow with nothing but debts and scars? But the answer was already written in his eyes. Some men fought for money, some for pride. Caleb fought because his soul could not do otherwise. The first riders appeared on the ridge just after sunrise, silhouettes against a rising sun that burned red as a wound. Lena counted 6, maybe 7. Rand was among them, she could tell, by the tilt of his shoulders. The sheriff rode at their center, coat flapping, pale eyes fixed on the cabin below. The earth trembled faintly under their hooves as they descended. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle resting easy in his arms. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He simply waited. Lena stood beside him with the scattergun. Her knees wanted to knock, but she locked them straight. Fear still lived in her bones, but alongside it now bloomed something else, fierce as thistle and twice as sharp. The riders stopped at the deadfall barricade. The sheriff's voice carried across the clearing. "Last chance, Gunslinger, hand her over. She's a debt unpaid, a poison in this land. You know it." Caleb's voice came back, even and low. "She's a woman who's alive, and that's worth more than any debt." Rand spat in the dirt. "Then you'll both die for it." The sheriff raised his hand. Guns were drawn, and then the world exploded. The first shot cracked through morning silence, splintering a cedar post. Lena flinched but did not fall. Caleb fired back, his rifle bucking once, dropping a rider clean from the saddle. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed. Gunpowder fouled the air with acrid smoke. Lena braced the scattergun against her shoulder the way Caleb had shown her, sighted not on a man's chest but on the rope that tethered the sheriff's horse. She squeezed. The blast tore the rope free, the horse rearing wild, throwing the sheriff sideways in the saddle. Rand charged forward, revolver flashing. Caleb's shot clipped his arm, spinning him around. But still he came, teeth bared like a wolf, eyes blood-bright with vengeance. Lena dropped to one knee, reloaded with shaking hands, and aimed at the ground just before him. The buckshot tore dirt into his face, blinding him. His curse split the air. Caleb's boot followed, slamming him down into the dust. The others hesitated then. Not because they lacked numbers, but because the gunslinger fought like a man who counted every bullet as a promise, and because the woman beside him refused to run. The sheriff steadied his horse, fury etched across his pale features. He leveled, his pistol at Lena. "Enough!" For a breath, time slowed. Lena saw the barrel, the dark circle that meant death. She felt the thrum of her own heart, the weight of her choice. She didn't flinch. Caleb stepped in front of her. The shot rang. Out. He staggered, breath hissing, but his Colt answered a heartbeat later. The sheriff's hat spun into the dirt, his gun clattering after. He reeled, pale eyes wide with shock. The riders faltered. With their leader wounded and Rand groaning in the dust, the fight bled out of them. One by one, they pulled their horses. Back, retreating into the trees. Smoke hung heavy. Silence fell jagged. Lena dropped the scattergun and caught Caleb as he sagged against the porch rail. Blood darkened his shirt at the shoulder, but his eyes still burned steady. "You're hit," she whispered, terror clawing her throat. "Not deep," he rasped. "Still breathing." She pressed her hands to the wound, desperate, determined. "Not while I breathe, either." For the first time since she had met him, Caleb's lips curved, faint, fleeting, but real. Together they stood, battered but unbroken, watching as the sun rose higher over a clearing littered with proof. They had not bent, had not broken, had not yielded to the ledger of men who measured life by coin and contempt. Lena felt it then, stronger than fear, stronger than hunger, belonging. Not given by the town, not taken by force, but claimed by courage. And in that courage, she knew love had taken root. The cabin smelled of smoke and iron, a sharp blend of firewood and blood. Lena's hands were stained red as she pressed rags to Caleb's shoulder, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Each time his breath came steady, her own heart found the strength to keep beating. By mid-morning, the bleeding slowed. Caleb leaned back against the wall, pale but unshaken, his eyes half closed, but when Lena shifted to check the bandage, his voice rumbled soft. "You've got a strong hand," he said. Her throat tightened. "I thought I'd lose you." "You didn't." He opened his eyes fully then, fixing her with a look that carried both weight and promise. "And you won't, so long as we both stand." She turned away quickly, blinking tears. Through the open window, The prairie stretched out wide and endless, the sky so blue it hurt. For the first time, she didn't see it as empty. She saw rows of beans, a split-rail fence, smoke curling from the chimney in peace instead of battle. Word of... The fight carried faster than the wind. By the next afternoon, neighbors began to trickle up the cedar path, folk who had turned their shutters tight when Lena begged for water. A woman brought poultices for Caleb's shoulder. A farmer left a sack of seed potatoes without a word. Even the barber's wife came with her boy in tow, holding a tin of dried herbs. "They say you stood against the sheriff himself," she murmured, awe beneath her words. "Maybe it's time this town remembered what standing looks like." Lena accepted the herbs, her hands steady. For the first time, she didn't bow her head. Caleb watched it all from the porch, his arms still bound in linen. His eyes followed Lena as she moved among the people, grateful, determined, no longer a shadow, but a flame that drew others near. When the visitors were gone, she joined him on the porch. The evening sun spilled copper across the land, painting every blade of grass with light. "They'll come again, won't they?" she asked. Caleb's jaw worked, thoughtful. Maybe not the sheriff. That shot shook his pride. But men like Rand don't stop easy. Trouble finds its way. Lena folded her arms, staring out over the land. "Then we'll be ready. I'm done hiding." He looked at her then, long and steady, as though measuring more than her words, measuring the steel that had been tempered in her. At last, he nodded. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly. "Always were. Just needed a place to let it grow." She smiled faintly, eyes burning with unshed tears. "Then let's grow it here." Spring came early. The ground softened, and Lena's garden pushed green through the soil. She bent to tend rows of beans and potatoes, dirt under her nails, the ledger now filled not with debts, but with sketches of sprouting leaves. Children sometimes came up from town to help, laughing, their pockets filled with chalk marks from her lessons on the little slate. Caleb's shoulder healed slowly, but he worked alongside her, cutting posts for a fence, his quiet strength steady as the sun's rising. Together, they built more than walls. They built belonging. One evening, as the sky blazed purple and gold, Caleb leaned on the porch rail, watching her set a lantern in the garden. "Still too bright," he teased softly. She shook her head, smiling. "It's not for them. It's for me. For us." He stepped closer then, and the warmth of his presence wrapped her more surely than any blanket. His hand brushed hers, rough and scarred but careful. She didn't pull away. In the hush of twilight, their eyes met, and no words were needed. Love had taken root, stubborn as wildflowers, fierce as the prairie wind. The land would remain harsh, the town would always carry its shadows. But Lena knew now that hardship did not mean defeat. She had stood, she had chosen, and in choosing, she had found both her strength and the man whose breath had carried her from death into life again. As stars blinked awake in the sky, she whispered the vow she'd first heard from him, the vow that had become her own. "Not while I breathe." And, with that promise carried into the night, the prairie no longer seemed endless. It felt like home. If Lena's courage and Caleb's heart touched something quiet and true inside your soul, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Out here in the Wild West, love may be hard-won, but it's always worth the fight. Join us for more stories of grit, sacrifice, and hearts that endure against all odds.